I lived in China for 11 years, learned Mandarin to fluency, started a business, gave speeches in Chinese, played music all around the country, immersed as much as I could in the culture and society, and I'm going to compress all of the advice I have to someone about to go to China into this one video. Hey, ni hao. If you don't know me, I'm Phil Crimmins. I created Mandarin Blueprint with my buddy Luke to fix the broken Mandarin education system once and for all. Our courses are helping thousands of members reach university-level Chinese in a fraction of the time. In this video, I'll cover 4 broad categories that ought to make your trip to China as rewarding as possible. The basics, transportation and sightseeing, food and drink, and interacting with Chinese culture and people. Now, I'm going to cover a lot of ground, from things like apps to download and things to pack, all the way to how to handle politically sensitive topics. Now, there will be a lot of action steps and cultural perspectives based on my years of experience in China, but of course, preparing to visit a civilization with as much culture and history as China can never be summed up in one video. Still, I feel confident that you're going to get a lot out of this, so let's dive in. The basics. Number 1, tech you should prepare ahead of time. Go ahead and download the following apps. Ctrip. This is kind of like Expedia, and it's for bookings. You can buy train tickets there. Qunar. This is an app that's for airfare, and you'll usually get better prices using the Chinese app than using an external app. Dianping. This is like Yelp, so it'll help you find a good restaurant in the area. WeChat and Alipay. These are really important, but I'll talk more about them in a bit. Make sure you have ChatGPT for translation, and Pleco is a quick dictionary. Also, this is a little one, but it's easy to forget. Save the emergency numbers to your phone, including the police, 110, 110, fire, 119, 119, and ambulance, 120. 120. Also, be sure to get a VPN before you arrive so you can get over the Great Firewall and visit Western websites. You may need it because you'll need to check your email or you need to message someone, and if you don't have a VPN, you won't be able to. Now, I like Astral, and the reason is because I used it for many years without any major issues, and they're not a sponsor. We don't have any sponsors on this podcast. But many other Western VPNs that you do hear about in various podcast advertisements don't work at all in China. For example, NordVPN, I used to hear all about that. Well, it didn't work for me. And then ExpressVPN, while it does work sometimes in China, my friends were always complaining about ExpressVPN's shoddy connection. But Phil, VPNs are illegal in China. I'll talk about why you don't have to worry about that in a bit. And of course, you need a VPN to take advantage of the next section. The basics. Number 2, survival communication. Be sure to utilize ChatGPT or another translation app. It's important because you're going to need it at some point. And then use Pleco for quick, simple phrases as it's more instant. At least it doesn't have to think like ChatGPT. And maybe your VPN's not connected very well and maybe it doesn't totally work so well. So have Pleco available because you can just pull something up instantly. Also, have a screenshot of your hotel address written in Chinese because you can't communicate with just pinyin. There's only so many syllables in Chinese, so if you show the pinyin to a taxi driver, they're not going to know what hotel you're talking about necessarily unless it's really famous. Now, I already mentioned downloading WeChat, and I gotta tell you, this is the most important app to have before you go to China. I very rarely texted people or had phone calls. Everything was through WeChat. Text, video calls, sending money, sharing things on social media. It was all happening on WeChat. And people will frequently ask to add your WeChat, and it's definitely the best way to stay in touch with people. The basics. Number 3, travel prep. It's easy to forget that China requires a visa for citizens of most Western countries to travel there. And because the visa laws vary from country to country, I won't give you specific advice here other than to say, do your research about the visa requirements for citizens of your country well before your trip so that you can complete any procedures ahead of time. Sometimes there's a long wait and there's rarely a negative consequence for getting it sorted out too early. The basics. Number 4, cash, money, and banking. Before your trip, exchange some cash for Chinese yuan before arrival for emergencies. And by the way, yuan in China is often referred to as RMB because it's short for renminbi, the people's currency. Generally, you're actually going to want to use Alipay or WeChat to pay for stuff, and this introduces a problem because Alipay and WeChat can't just be used with a Western bank account. Now, having a Chinese bank account linked to WeChat and Alipay is certainly the most flexible way to use these two apps, and you can look into it. Some people may not have a problem getting a Chinese bank account, but depending on your visa and depending on your country, they may not allow it. While that's true, there have been some developments in this area. Apparently now, and this wasn't the case when I lived there, but apparently now you can associate WeChat with an international credit card. So I've linked to an article below from wise.com about how you can do this. It's new to me, but I'm sure that you can just follow the instructions there. And then another option would be to give some cash to a trusted Chinese friend and have them send you the equivalent amount on WeChat. And that money will exist in your WeChat wallet, your qianbao. So why is this so important? Well, WeChat and Alipay are accepted frickin' everywhere. Even street vendors and homeless beggars will have a little QR code. And so there are many services that only accept this as a form of payment now. So it's incredibly efficient and it's easy compared to Western payment systems. And weirdly, banking in China is a huge pain in the neck, but WeChat and Alipay are somehow super easy to use. And it was very interesting to observe this phenomenon because I lived through it. When I first moved to China in 2011, it was a mostly cash-based society. You could still buy things with a card in a store, but it was kind of rare. I remember I would pull out my card sometimes and people would be like, let me use the card reader. I'm not used to that. So it's very cash-based, right? And then between, I would say, 2013 and 2015, the country transitioned to being entirely cashless. Everybody had WeChat and Alipay. Everybody had a QR code. You would get your QR code in your phone, scanned, beep, paid, done. And it was amazing because the cashless banking system skipped the decades of credit card development and Byzantine payment systems of the West. It kind of reminds me of those African countries that never ended up getting telephone lines because by the time they would have developed to having telephone lines, cell phones already existed, and so they just built cell towers and everybody has cell phones now. So because they developed later in this payment system, it's therefore less Byzantine and more efficient. It's kind of cool. The basics, number 5, time zone. Be aware that China only has one time zone, Beijing time, which is UTC +8, and there is no daylight savings time, there's no standard time, there's no clock changes. This was a CCP decision in 1949 when they took over, and while it's certainly convenient, it does create some strange phenomenons. For example, on the winter solstice, the sun rises at 7:30 a.m. in Beijing and 9:30 a.m. in China's westernmost city of Kashgar, Xinjiang. Side note, this is why the Uyghurs in Xinjiang often follow an unofficial time zone that's appropriately set 2 hours earlier. The basics, number 6, holidays. Be aware of the national holidays before you go. There are a lot of little ones, but the big 5 are Dragon Boat Festival in late May, early June, the Qingming or Tomb Sweeping Festival in early April, Mid-Autumn Festival in mid-September, sometimes early October, and National Week or Golden Week from October 1st to the 8th. October 1st is Guoqingjie. It's kind of just National Day. It's kind of like 4th of July in the US. And the mother of them all, Spring Festival. Spring Festival starts with Chinese New Year, so it's the first day of the lunar calendar and thus varies year to year. But it usually starts somewhere between late January and mid-February. And for Spring Festival, everything in the country changes. Commercial enterprises are often around 80 to 90% shut down, and many people take a full month off. Also, quick tip, for Qingming Festival, the Tomb Sweeping Festival, don't wish people a happy tomb sweeping day. It's a somber holiday meant to reflect on their ancestors, so it's not meant to be a joyful holiday. Learned that one from experience. The basics, number 7, skills to acquire before you go. Last but not least for the basics, learn simple Mandarin greetings, how to ask for directions, and get a grip on pronunciation. Yes, there are a lot of Chinese people who can speak some English, but if you want the best and most rewarding experience, you should at least have some of the basics mastered. Lucky for you, we have a free pronunciation training right here on our YouTube channel. And if you want a more guided and comprehensive experience, our courses Pronunciation Mastery and Mandarin Speaking and Listening Kickstarter are the ideal preparation. Links in the description. Transportation and sightseeing. Traveling around the cities and the country in China is actually quite easy, but there are some little wrinkles that I want to tell you about. So here are 6 topics that I've gleaned from my 11 years in China that I think you'll find very useful. So number 1, getting around a city. Be sure to use the subway systems in the major cities. China has done a great job of developing these. They often put subway stations even where they anticipate that there's going to be a need for it. And so the subways themselves are very clean. They're new and they have glass barriers that stop you from potentially falling onto the track, so they're safe. And it's kind of like that thing I mentioned before about how China was able to skip some of the Byzantine cash money banking situations that have come across in the West because it developed later. Well, it's the same thing here. The London Underground, the New York subway, they're really old. So of course they're dirty and they're not as safe. And in China, they developed later, so they had better technology when they built them. And so they are cleaner, safer, and they're very cheap as well. So that's quite nice. And then you can also use Didi, which is the comparable company to Uber and Lyft in China. And it's also way cheaper than the US. So if you're going to a place that doesn't have a subway station all that close by, I would recommend that. So you've got your subway system, you have your Didi, and another thing you can do is use the rental bikes that are all over the city. These rental bikes are great, but it's another reason to get WeChat Pay set up because the only way to use them is to scan the QR code. It connects to a payment system, which is either going to be WeChat or Alipay. And if there's no money in it, it won't unlock. So you get that set up. You just scan the little QR code, the bike unlocks, and now you can use it for as long as you need and then just lock it up when you're done and it automatically calculates the time. It often ends up being like 2 or 3 RMB. And so that's about 50 cents. Right, we're not less than 50 cents. We're not talking about a major expense here. And so it allows you to do things like get from your hotel or apartment to a subway station. Or, sometimes I would use them for slightly longer journeys, but it's just nice that you always have a bike available if you need. Now, I would say that if you're going to be in a city for a longer period of time, you might want to consider getting an e-bike. They're not that expensive, and it's one of the better ways to get around. I had one for a bit. I stopped using it because I preferred just to get the exercise, but I think that between subway, Didi, rental bikes, and e-bikes, getting around a city in China is very easy, especially because a lot of Chinese cities are built in the ring road system, which means that you can easily figure out where you are by basis of these concentric circles that go around the city. And that was the case in Beijing. It was the case in Chengdu when I lived in those two cities. And I found it very easy to understand where I was because it's kind of like a compass automatically. And so I would highly recommend exploring a city because it's quite fun. But that leads me to number 2, getting around the country. Now look, the high-speed rail network in China is unbelievable. I once walked out of my apartment, grabbed a rental bike, cycled to the subway, took the subway to the train station, took the high-speed rail to Shenzhen, and then I took the subway into Hong Kong, and I was walking around central Hong Kong, and then I marveled at the fact that I never needed a car the whole time. So that high-speed rail network is unbelievable, but they also have great airports. They built a new airport in Chengdu when I was there, and they almost always have an airport express train in the major cities. So you can use C-Trip to buy train tickets, and you can probably buy plane tickets there as well, but if you want to, you could use Qunar for domestic flights. So those are 2 of the apps I recommended that you download, and they'll be very helpful in this situation. And I would just comment that this is a situation of major cities being connected, and of course China is connecting more and more places to their high-speed rail network, and there are at least airports at some of the smaller cities. But whenever you're in a major city, all of these things are going to exist. Whether you're in Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, Shenzhen, they're going to have an airport express, they're going to have a highly developed subway system, and they're going to have high-speed rail connection. So the ability to move around China is very helpful. And it's one of those things where they made a decision years ago that, okay, it's not that we aren't going to try to develop the rural areas at all, but one of the easiest ways that we can help people is make it easier for them to get from their rural poor area to a rich city. So you could think of it, I remember I was listening to a Chinese podcast one time, 逻辑思维, and Luo Zhenyu, he said that getting a train ticket is like getting a green card for somebody who's in rural China, because by getting that train ticket and saving up to buy that train ticket, which is relatively affordable, but it's like $15 or something, but if you're in a rural part of China, getting $15 takes a while, but they'd save up for that and then go to the city, and now suddenly their opportunities are way through the roof. So it was a very interesting way to look at it. That's kind of how China decided to deal with that. That said, I have seen rural areas that they have improved significantly economically speaking. They've improved the infrastructure and such, but just getting the ability for people to buy a train ticket that allows them to get to a city is part of the reason they have such fast urbanization. And that brings me to my next point, which is when to travel. So we have how to travel, but when should you travel? Because there are very important times when you should or should not travel depending on your preferences. So first things first, try to avoid going anywhere or doing anything during the national holidays, for real, especially during Spring Festival. It's like Christmas, but more intense. everyone goes home to see their families. The flurry of domestic travel has been dubbed 春运, and it's the single largest migration of people in the world, and it happens every year. So this is really important. If you're in the national holiday week or you're in spring festival week, you're going to be in a difficult situation with travel, and I would recommend just avoiding it entirely. But you might think, well, I won't travel to another city, but I'll go to the local scenic area. But this would also be a bad idea during a national holiday. Most scenic areas have designated paths that you're supposed to follow. And so, one time I was in Yading Jingxu. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's in Western Sichuan. I would highly recommend it because it's just incredible. But a park worker started using a megaphone to very noisily and unpleasantly yell across nature at me because I was standing off of the walking path, right? So our editor to add in a picture of the walking path and the scenery. And if you can imagine, during national holiday or spring festival, if you're only allowed in the walking path and you're not just allowed to spread out, then it's just going to be jammed with people. While I can sort of understand the decision to be like, no, just stay on the walking path so that you're not trampling on the nature, it does just bother me because it's like, I'm just walking on the earth. What's the problem here, But anyway, so they have that rule, and as a result, everybody gets packed in on the path. And so if it's a national holiday and everybody and their mother is going to the Yading Jingxu, then you don't want to be there at that time. So instead of traveling during the national holidays, research and book tickets for popular attractions in advance. So just pick a reputable hotel. It won't be too much more expensive than the guy on the street who's offering tours, but you'll get the best experience. Now, how about the climate and the weather? China has a similar latitude to the US, so it has a similar air temperature climate. Very cold in the north during the winter, and it can get very hot during the summer, especially in the three furnaces of China, Xi'an, Chongqing, and Wuhan. There's something about the topography of these cities and the way that the heat gets trapped there that they get extra hot compared to cities who are, in some cases, even a little bit further south than them, but there's something about these three cities that encourages heat. I actually lived in Chongqing for the summer of 2013, and it was the first time in my life where I thought, holy crap, I need to get inside. It's getting dangerous how hot it is out here. And, I'm losing too much sweat and whatever. So I would highly recommend that if you're going to travel to China during the summer, try not to go to a place that is one of these three furnaces. And if you just don't like the heat, maybe don't go to the far south of China as well. Go up to Harbin in Heilongjiang in the northeast and enjoy that side of things, or enjoy the Gobi Desert, something like that. But don't go to one of these three furnaces of China if the heat bothers you. And in the winter, Inner Mongolia, Heilongjiang, Liaoning province, Jilin province, boy are they cold. Even Beijing's quite cold during the winter, so just be prepared for that. Of course you can bundle up, and the Harbin ice show is quite beautiful, so maybe you want to go there during the winter, but it's cold, so just be ready for that. Now that brings me to transportation and sightseeing number 4, scams to avoid. Watch out for pickpockets in crowded areas in big cities. It's not as prevalent as it is in some European cities, but it's out there. In all my years in China, I never got pickpocketed, but I also always brought awareness to the situation. So I would just recommend that you apply a reasonable level of precaution and you should be fine. Regarding other scams, while it's certainly less common than it used to be when China was poorer, you can still easily run into people who are trying to get one over on you. So just try to watch out for anyone who's super friendly and they're coming up to you and they want to be your friend for no obvious reason. They probably are running some kind of a game. And if you go into a tea shop or a souvenir store, be prepared to get offered a foreigner price in touristy areas. I have been to Dali and Lijiang, which are two little ancient towns in Yunnan province. They're very beautiful places, but in the very center of the ancient town, they have a bunch of little ticky-tacky stores, and it's like one store is selling a bunch of African djembes for some reason. It's really common. There's a lot of tea shops, there's a lot of silver shops and whatever. And it's not that none of these places have something that might be legitimately fine to buy, but they're just looking for people who are chumps in this situation. So just be careful. And it's always possible to negotiate and haggle. I would just recommend that if you want to haggle, just one piece of advice on haggling in China is look at a few things. Identify the thing you want, but don't go after that first. Then make an offer on something you don't want. Go like, oh, way too expensive. And then maybe the thing that you do want, be like, kind of like as an afterthought, kind of go, oh, what's that though? What's that? And then they say a price and you go like, I thought it should be about, and then say about an eighth of the price. So like they say, oh, that's 80 RMB. And you're like, I would have thought that would be 10 RMB, right? And then start to walk out. And in my experience, 100% of the time, as you start to walk out, they will offer you a lower price. So it's just that one technique. And of course, if you want, you can get into a back and forth haggle with them if that is your type of thing. I don't particularly like to do it, but it's a way to handle things. Now, the next area where you could potentially get scammed is with taxis. And so my general rule of thumb is this. Just refuse anyone offering you a taxi at the airport or train station that isn't from the legitimate taxi line. All the legitimate taxis tend to line up at a set location and people will just wait in line to get one. Just get in that line, you'll be fine. You can use the DD app as well. Depends on the train station or the airport, because sometimes they won't allow the DDs to come all the way in and they just give that to the city taxis, which, fair enough. But if you get into the line that everyone else is in, it won't be a scam. And if you ever get into a taxi and they don't start running the meter, insist that the driver turns on the 计程表. That's the meter. And so if they have one but they aren't using it, it's definitely a scam, and you're going to end up having this conflict at the end of the taxi ride where they're asking for way more money than they should, and it's just very unpleasant. So there was actually one time when I was in Changsha with my bandmates, and we had just finished a show. We went downtown to have dinner, and on our way back, the taxi driver had the meter running, but the meter was going up way faster than the taxi that took us downtown. So we had a point of reference. So we knew, okay, this taxi should cost about 50 RMB because it was kind of far away. And this guy was already at 50 RMB, a quarter of the way there. And we were like, yo. And so even that can happen. The best thing to do if you're just in the city and you need to use a taxi is to use Didi. And if you're at the airport or train station, just get into the line that has taxis waiting and they're the official city taxis, because in that case, then you won't have a problem. And that brings me to transportation and sightseeing number 5, traffic. Traffic in China is a bit different. Expect very loose attention paid to road laws. The unwritten rule of Chinese traffic is me first. Now, it seems impolite, but there's actually moments when you see a sort of beautiful flow to it. Everything just kind of keeps moving, and it can be quite disconcerting as a pedestrian, because sometimes you'll go through a crosswalk and notice that the car approaching the crosswalk is not slowing down. But it's because they assume you're going to continue at your current speed, and by the time they get there, you'll be through the crosswalk. So the attitude is not like, I'm going to make sure that you as a pedestrian don't feel intimidated. It's, I'm going to look at your trajectory, and I'm going to assume your trajectory stays the same, and I'm going to just keep going straight because I can predict how long it's going to take me to get there and how long it's going to take you to get out of there. And so we'll just be in the flow. And so when you see everybody actually behaving this way, like I say, it's kind of this amazing flow of people and movement and whatever. And so just be ready for that, because it's not what you're used to if you're from, say, the UK or the US, and it is more dangerous. I mean, look, at the end of the day, people aren't as predictable as you might hope they are, so you just have to keep your wits about you. And it's kind of a good thing because it forces you not to be walking around looking at your phone if you're in traffic. You have to pay attention. So I have 2 suggestions for dealing with Chinese traffic. One is just don't look at your phone while you're walking through crosswalks or you're not in a very safe spot on the sidewalk. If you're ever dealing with an intersection or going on the street at all, just pay attention, because you're not going to be used to how it works. And then the second thing is make it clear that you're going whenever you decide to make a move. Others will slow down. I've learned it. If you make your intentions obvious and you walk with purpose, or you're on your bike and you move with purpose, they will slow down because they're like, okay, you're going, that's fine. So walk or drive decisively, whether you're stopping or going, and you'll be fine. Hesitation is what will increase the likelihood of an accident significantly. And then one final point I want to make about traffic, and this is sort of a compliment to Chinese people, is that they taught me that you do not have to have road rage. I saw incidences of road rage twice in my 11 years in China. It's just a rare thing. People will be driving and a car will nearly hit them. They'll just be like, oh, almost died. But just keep driving. They don't have an instinct to yell at somebody or get angry. And they're right. After something happened, there's nothing you're going to do about it. If you didn't get into an accident and nothing happened, then what are you going to do? Sue the person for almost hitting you? There's nothing that you can do when something happens in traffic like that. So you might as well just let it go. And as a result, upon returning to the US, now when I drive around, I never had much road rage, but I have 0 now. Because I just look at it as if you did something dumb in traffic, it's just nature taking its course. So I don't have to get mad about it. And I learned that from Chinese people, and I think that's great. Number 6, final travel points. It's important to remember that if you're going to travel to a rural area in China, power cuts might occur, so pack a flashlight. And this also leads me to comment a little bit on the difference between urban and rural in China. Urban living in China is first world. It's the same as anywhere else. In fact, it has some advantages, considering the high-speed rail, the subway systems, the ability of having an integrated money system that works throughout. City life in China is pretty darn good. It's like a first world city, in many cases, first world plus. However, when you get out to the rural areas, which I've done many, many times, especially in western Sichuan and the mountains, while there is improvement, and there certainly was improvement from 2011 to 2022 when I moved out, there is still a struggle to catch up with the rest of the country. There's not as much electricity, there are poorer plumbing systems, and generally, actually, that's one of the things that even the cities don't have as good as Western countries, as the plumbing systems are a little bit whack, to put it simply. And you have lack of potable water from the tap, although that's kind of true everywhere in the country. But the point is that you have a standard of living that is considerably lower than the first world cities, so you need to prepare. And one of those things is to bring a flashlight. Another thing is to make sure that you carry toilet paper or wet wipes and hand sanitizer. This is even true in a city. Many public restrooms may not provide these, so it's just a good idea to have it, just in case. You just don't want to be caught without it. And then if you're going to do any kind of traveling, bring your passport everywhere. And also, another thing that you may run into, and this really depends on where you go, but you may have to register at every hotel at the local police station. I've even had to do that. I remember in Gansu province one time, I was doing a drum festival in Lanzhou, the capital, and we had to travel something like 5 or 6 miles to a police station just to register us as staying at the hotel. And this hasn't happened in many other places that I've gone, so it's not a guarantee, but just be prepared for it, because if you don't see it coming, you might feel a little weird about it, but it is kind of a common practice. So with that in mind, those are my 6 tips about travel and sightseeing. With that, let's go ahead and move into food and drink. In China, food is kind of a big deal. 民以食为天. So I'm going to cover the 6 things you really need to know when you're dealing with restaurants or just eating around China, and I bet you'll really like it. So number 1, 八大菜系, the 8 systems of Chinese cuisine. 川菜 from Sichuan. I ate a lot of that while I was in Chengdu. You have 鲁菜 from Shandong. You have 苏菜 from Jiangsu. You have 粤菜 from Guangdong. You have 浙菜 from Zhejiang. You have 闽菜 from Fujian. You have 湘菜 from Hunan, and you have 徽菜 from Anhui. Now, those are only 8 of the provinces in China, but there are more provinces than that, so this doesn't actually constitute everything there is to eat in China. There's way more than that. Every province has unique food, and even different cities within the same province have different specialties. You could spend 10 years going from place to place trying new dishes every day, and you'd likely still not try everything. Italian and French food are the best food in the world. Maybe, I don't know, but I can guarantee you Chinese food is by far the most diverse. And I love a bunch of dishes from the various cai xi, but my favorite food is actually Xinjiang cai. Xinjiang is located in a place where you get influence from the Middle East, China, and India. And so the combination of the various different systems of cuisine make it my favorite, but that's not even one of the 8 big systems of Chinese cuisine. So there's such a diverse array of food that you can try, and so I would highly recommend trying different things. If you see a restaurant that does Anhui cuisine, go ahead and check it out and have some of the dishes there so you can get a sense of how it really is quite different. We look at Sicily versus Northern Italy versus Naples, right? There's different types of food and it's really great. Same thing with China and even more so. Number 2, table etiquette and getting the bill. Family style eating, which is just sharing dishes on one big table, that's the norm in China. You're not going to get your own plate of food unless you're at a Western restaurant. So using your own chopsticks to serve others is polite. People do it all the time. And speaking of, it's important to understand the basics of chopstick etiquette. Don't stick it in rice or point with them, or especially use them as drumsticks, as I'm wont to do as a drummer. So those are things you want to make sure you do. But at the end of the meal, it's customary for one person to pay the bill. While it's not unheard of to split the bill, it's like they have a term for it called AA zhi. But that develops because Westerners wanted to split bills. Like, they don't generally split the bill. It's like, I'll pay this time, you pay next time, and we'll not really keep track of it completely, but that's sort of the general thing. And so while it's a cool system, it does result in this interesting cultural phenomenon where people get into these sort of like niceness fights where they're like, I'll pay. No, I'll pay. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen many, many times where there's like a fight to pay the bill. And it's funny because sometimes it gets a little low-key aggressive. It's like, I'll hurt you if you don't let me do this nice thing for you. And so it's kind of funny. But if you are ever out with some friends, I would highly recommend the first time you go out with your Chinese friends, offer to treat them to the meal. And the way you say treat in Chinese is 请 me, 我请你 you. 我请你, right? And if you're with more than one person, 我请你们. Men is the plural in Chinese. So 我请你们. So you're out with 3 Chinese friends and the bill's coming due, you say 我请你们, right? And by saying that, you're saying, I will treat you to this meal. They might counteract and say, no, you're a guest in China, I will pay for it. But I just think if you at least try, and you can decide whether or not you want to let them go ahead and pay or you pay. But I'm just saying if you offer, it will be very well received and you will be respecting them. Now, there's no need to tip at a restaurant, so that's nice. And as a result, servers do not constantly come over and interrupt your conversation to say, so how is everything, in hopes of getting a good tip. Instead, if you need help, you simply shout, 服务员, which is just the way you say server or waiter, and they'll happily come over. Now, this goes against every American instinct I have. We consider it rude to yell out for the waiter. We just try to silently get their attention and hope they're paying attention. But in China, perfectly fine to call out because their attitude is, you'll call me when you need me, so I'm not going to come over unless you call me. So in fact, if you don't call them, they'll never come over. If you just get used to this, I mean, obviously these days, there's some call buttons sometimes. If you're in a particularly busy hot pot restaurant with lots of different waiters and stuff, they usually have a call button because it's kind of too loud in there for you to just yell out. But the point is that this is perfectly fine to do. And because there is no tipping, getting the check is super efficient because you simply scan a QR code with WeChat or Alipay and input the exact amount. There's no need to calculate any tip percentage or anything like that. So that's nice. And of course you can still pay cash, but again, if you're paying cash, you just pay the exact amount. And if you're a little bit over, it's not that you can't tip, it's just that there is no expectation for you to do so. And so if you do it, there will be some confusion for a moment, right? So especially if they're being run by somebody who's from a rural place that doesn't have as much connection to like, oh, in America, they tip their waiters. They may not be aware of that at all. So it's like, if that's the case, then you're just going to confuse them if you're trying to offer a tip. So that brings me to my third point about food and drink, which is street food. Try the local cuisine, but be cautious with street food hygiene. 地沟油, which is gutter oil, is actually a thing. It's very gross. It's like they collect oil that goes into the gutter from various restaurants that are throwing it away, and they'll use it to cook stuff. I mean, obviously this is not every single street vendor and all that, but it has been uncovered that people do this. But here's the thing. I want to tell you the bad part first because some of it is so delicious that it's worth the occasional la douze. It would be a real shame to miss one of the uniquely charming and delicious things about China simply because you were worried about the hygiene situation. I've had so many foods in China that were absolutely amazing. And sure, I stopped having as much street food after I'd been there for a few years because it was like, okay, I've had the experience now. But if you've never been, my goodness, it's so delicious. The jianbing, which is like a fried bread with some like meats and veg in the middle, and then they have various tuar, xiaokao. Like these things are so delicious, and they have these various Chinese spices that you're not used to having as much if you don't eat mainland Chinese food. Mainland Chinese food is definitely different from the American style Chinese food that you'll have in the US. And so most of that, by the way, is Cantonese cuisine. It's Hong Kong inspired. It's not to say you can't find anything that's mainland inspired in the US, but it's harder. And so when you're there, have the street food. It's so delicious and such an interesting experience. So I would just highly recommend, do not skip out on this just because you're afraid that maybe you'll have a little bit of a digestive episode. Worth the risk. Number 4, water. This is a quick one, but very important. Tap water is not drinkable. There are too many heavy metals in it. Stick to bottled water. Also, because of a belief in Chinese traditional medicine, most water is served hot or at room temperature. Now, I hated this at first. I've come to actually kind of enjoy it. I do think that sometimes the hot water that you sip is quite nice. But if you want cold water, you're going to have to ask for it. Number 5, eating dogs. Look, people always say Chinese people eat dogs, and dog is eaten in China, but only by a tiny minority of people. overall it's seen as weird and gross by pretty much everyone. Dogs are an extremely common and beloved pet in China, and because Western media has covered it so much, I often look for it in menus and restaurants. I would say, like, this place have dog, right? And I would never find it. Now, granted, I didn't research to find a restaurant that serves dog, but the fact that I never saw it in the hundreds of restaurants I ate at across the country was proof enough to me that the rumor that Chinese love eating dog is greatly exaggerated. My only recommendation there is just to recognize that it's not all that common. Number 6, delivery apps. Eating from home, Ele.me and Meituan are two of the incredible delivery apps in China. They're kind of similar to DoorDash or Postmates or things like that. And you're going to need WeChat or Alipay, or at least a card that is accepted in China, because that's how you pay for it, of course. And it's also crazy fast because they have loads of guys on delivery e-bikes all over the major cities. So there were some issues that came up a few years ago where these delivery guys were feeling so much pressure to get their orders delivered in time that they were creating traffic accidents, and there was this big uproar, at least in Chengdu. It may not be the case in other cities. Like, for example, I pointed this out in a YouTube short previously, and some guy was like, I'm in Shenzhen, and like, it's still a problem. And it doesn't surprise me because Shenzhen is like China plus. Like, everything that happens in China is sort of turned up to 11 in Shenzhen, both good and bad. It doesn't surprise me because there's way more pressure there. But in Chengdu anyway, there was sort of an uproar from people of like, hey, I'm willing to get my food 5 minutes later if it helps prevent traffic accidents. These guys are everywhere and they're just being erratic in traffic. And so nowadays it's a much better situation. They're paying them better and they're not giving them such terrible incentives that make them rush. Now I'd like to talk to you about interacting with the Chinese culture and Chinese people. This section is going to be very wide ranging, and it's important to understand that China has a massive population with a lot more diversity than it may seem on the surface. And I'm going to share with you some observations about Chinese culture and people, but I'd like to make a blanket caveat that I'm merely reporting patterns that I observed over my 11 years in the country. Of course, I never mean to imply that everyone thinks or acts a certain way, but if it happened enough for me to spot a pattern, it's quite likely you'll find it useful. So first, I'll make a few rapid fire observations and then I'll get into some deeper topics. So here we go. Number 1, demeanor. Most folks are extremely polite, complimentary, and welcoming. This is sort of the interactions that you have that don't go too deep. So if you're interacting with somebody at a store or just out in the street, people are willing to help. A lot of foreigners will talk about moments where they were lost or stuck and somebody came by to help. Maybe they just want to practice their English. Maybe they have some self-interested reason for wanting to help you, but I kind of don't care, because it's like, if people are polite and complimentary and welcoming, then what's the problem? I mean, you can think of many countries where people are not that way. So I like this a lot. It's a standard kind of demeanor you'll see. Number 2, greetings. First of all, bowing is very rare. That's a Japanese thing, not a Chinese thing. And it's actually because it's a Japanese thing, Chinese people don't want to do it, right? Because they have a lot of animosity there between those two countries. So it's common to nod and smile respectively. Handshakes are fine too, but hugs are very rare. So I wouldn't recommend just being like, I'm a hugger, and pulling people in. Handshake is fine at first. Number 3, outlook. There are a lot of optimistic people around in China. The word for tomorrow in Chinese is 明天, and the word for next year is 明年, and that character 明 means bright. So the bright day is tomorrow and the bright year is next year. To this day, no matter what challenges China is facing, there's a consistent, if not a bit naive, perspective that the best is yet to come. And it is quite nice to be around that. And it also, some of it is a little bit of propaganda, because they don't necessarily know what the problems are that are facing the country because it's a bit suppressed. Although some things they do know, because the propaganda isn't just like, it's not that simplistic. It's not just like, only put good things about China and nothing bad. There will be things in the news that are reporting challenges and negativities that are happening. It's just that you won't have the full picture. Number 4, public behavior. Most people dress pretty modestly in public and are not super boisterous while outdoors. However, indoors in, say, like a hot pot restaurant, it's full force 热闹. 热闹 means like hot and noisy, and that is exactly the way you would describe the environment in a hot pot restaurant. It's fun. It's kind of, they really dig into it and enjoy it. They're just having a great time with their friends, eating, drinking, and they love the revelry of it all. It's kind of funny because when you're out in the street, just walking down the street, occasionally you'll have somebody who might be from a rural area. They're a migrant worker and maybe they're being loud or something. But they'll say, 他没有素质, which means he doesn't have any culture. So there's sort of like a looking down down your nose on people like that. The average person is just a city dweller who's been there for a while. Out in the world, not too boisterous, not too like all over the place. But again, when you get into sort of this indoor public place, it can be quite renau and fun. It's really great. Number 5, smoking. Listen, smoking is still pretty common in China. It doesn't have the stigma that it has in the West. So if you want to ask for a non-smoking section in a restaurant, some places will have it, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. Smoke-filled toilets and shopping malls are common. Small restaurants, you're not gonna be able to avoid it. It's usually just one room. And I've even seen it in gyms, which is always I found to be a bit ironic. You're in the locker room at the gym and a guy's smoking and you're like, hey, I'm trying to be here for my health. Another thing about this is that people will offer you cigarettes all the time. I used to work in the Kempinski Hotel restaurant and we would go over to different tables and we would talk to the various people who were sitting around the tables, and they were always happy we were performing and they would offer cigarettes, and occasionally I would accept just to be polite, but I eventually had to just be like, I'm sorry, I don't smoke. It was one of those things where even though it is culturally a good thing to accept a gift, you have to be willing to draw a line when it comes to your own body. And in my experience, Chinese people did not resent me for it. They were just like, all right, you don't want to smoke, cool. Number 6, spitting. While we're on bad habits, spitting is also a thing and unfortunately rather prevalent. Obviously it's unhygienic, but mostly it's kind of gross because people will just really hock. That said though, it is trending in the right direction. You see, spitting actually leads me to another point I wanted to make about China, which is the generation gap. So maybe we'll call this section spitting and the generation gap, because older people in China, the boomers, they lived through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. So they have been through hell. That's not an exaggeration. And so if anybody has some gray in their hair, they've seen some stuff. And the young generation has grown up post-economic miracle. They've had all this technology. China has been way richer. And so the difference in their worldviews are so massive. It's actually important to remember the age of the person who is doing something that you find to be maybe unpleasant. So if somebody's spitting next to you and you're like, oh, but that guy's like 80, then chances are the reason he's doing that is just because it's what was the norm during his time when China was as destitute and tyrannical as could be. And, the 20-year-old who's next to him would never dream of spitting on the ground like that. Now, of course, there are still people who are 20, 25 and are they 没有素质. They don't have culture and they'll do the spitting, but it's less common. It's certainly less common. Just be ready for it though, because the first time somebody's near you and you just hear them hawk up a loogie, you're going to be like, ugh. But remember, a lot of it is just generational. And that also, those generational differences, they come out in lots of different areas. And just to say that younger people want to see change. And so if you're looking at China and saying, oh, they're just this way, try to stop yourself from doing that by reminding yourself of the change that China has already been through, especially since 1979 with the reform and opening up, and that it could go any number of directions from this point. China is a process. America is a process. They're verbs. They're not one thing. And so it's continuing to develop, and it doesn't have to go in as dark of a direction as it might, and as many people predict. Number 7, punctuality. Not going to say Chinese people are always late, but being relaxed around time is pretty common. Certainly no need to take it personally if someone's late. I would say that there is probably a Taoist influence here that causes the sense of timing to be a little more flexible, but it's not too bad. It's not like you'll say, hey, meet me at 6 and they'll show up at 8:30. It's usually just they might be 15 to 30 minutes late. Number 8, drinking. Be prepared for rounds of toasts during meals. Know how to say ganbei, which means cheers. It literally means dry glass, so empty your glass. Sometimes in social gatherings for work, employees or salespeople hoping to develop a client relationship feel that they must keep up with the drinking of their counterparts, and this results in a lot of passed out people being pulled out of a restaurant by their colleagues. I would see this every weekend without fail. Part of the reason for that is that 20% of the population has an allergy to alcohol, and I think that there might even be a relationship between that group of people and Genghis Khan's lineage. I heard that somewhere. Maybe I'm wrong, fact check me. But amazingly, despite this being sort of embarrassing and dangerous to my eye, it often leads to a kind of mutual respect. Like, oh, you went down the path of getting blind drunk with me and you were vulnerable. That's kind of how they look at it. Actually, let's do that business deal. So that's why people do it, because it gets rewarded. Even though it's kind of dangerous and somewhat embarrassing, they'll do it every weekend. Number 9, face or mianzi. Mianzi is vital. in Chinese society. Do your best to avoid causing public embarrassment for someone else. I'll have more to say about this in a little bit, but the basic idea is you want to allow people to save face and not lose face if you want to be respectful. As with anything like this, because face is not as important in Western societies, you don't have to completely conform if somebody is doing something you find to be truly objectionable. However, you just want to be aware of it and try to conform where you can. I'll have more to say about this in a bit, so stay tuned. Number 10, the North-South divide. Chinese people vary greatly from north to south. Northerners are generally taller and bigger and stronger, tougher. They often have a more edgy sense of humor and don't take as much crap. Southerners, smaller by comparison, less aggressive, more easygoing. A local once told Luke that Northerners are like that due to a tougher climate, certainly colder, it's drier, diet, and fending off Mongol invaders for hundreds of years. Not to mention sharing a genetic lineage with a lot of those Mongols. Thanks, Genghis. But as a sidebar, I also speculate that Sichuanese people in particular are laid back because the Sichuan Basin is one of the most geographically blessed places in the world. Sichuan is considered a part of southern China. It's about as north as you can get while still being considered southern China. And it's surrounded on all sides by the natural defense of massive mountains, especially to the west. And it has an endless supply of fresh water that comes from the Himalayas and massive amounts of arable farmland. It's essentially a land of abundance. And so when there's less threat of destruction from outside invaders because you're well defended and there's so much abundance and water and food, well, why not be tolerant? And that's how Chengdu people were. I found them to be very 包容, which means to wrap up and include. It's the word for like tolerance and acceptance. And it really was the case. And it made Chengdu a very lovely place to live, very separate from the rest of China. And that's another thing, the different regions can have very separate cultures. Like people from Sichuan definitely believe they're Chinese. They don't think like, oh, we're separate from China, but they do have a distinct culture that they're proud of. And that can be true of many other places as well. And when it comes to what I experienced in Chengdu, you know what it's like if you were at a buffet and it was an all-you-can-eat buffet and there were 5 people in the whole restaurant. If somebody were like pushing the other people out of the way to try to get the food and like, knocking people over and hitting the food out of their hands so they could get food, you'd be like, what a jerk. There's enough for everyone, right? And that's kind of how the Sichuan Basin is. But of course, in places where things are more extreme, imagine it's like a UN truck that's coming to a group of 100 people and there's only enough food for 20 and you've got to get food for your family. If you push people out of the way, we'd be like, well, you're trying to survive, right? So abundance versus scarcity is a big element in what makes the different parts of China have the culture that they have. And if you're in a place that was historically much more under threat, then it wouldn't be that surprising that, for example, in the north, people are a bit more intolerant of BS. So just be aware of that north-south divide and don't take it personally if a northerner is a little bit brusque with you. Number 11, safety. China is ridiculously safe compared to many other countries. There's just far less violence on an interpersonal level, even when people are out drinking. My wife, who also lived in China for around 7 years, says that she never felt afraid of walking around the city late at night. And I don't see why she would. There's no reason to be afraid in particular. There's not like a lot of people around committing violent crimes, right? I also recall a conversation with a few of my female expat friends, and they were saying that they've never once been catcalled in China. And I was like, oh, that's really cool, because that means that it's not a common thing to be sort of disrespectful in that way, and that makes people feel a lot safer. Now, it's not a fairy tale land. I have heard of a couple of women who were groped in Beijing, and it was really gross and made me very angry. So I don't want to give a sense that there's just nothing wrong ever, but it is far less violent overall. Theft, on the other hand, is not uncommon, especially bikes and e-bikes. They're particularly targeted. There's like groups of people who go for it, but violent crime is rare. Now, that said, while it's generally true to say that Chinese people are very placid and tolerant in this manner, everyone has a breaking point. Once you cross that line, you could end up with about 10 people beating you up at once or getting a bottle smashed over your head, which actually happened to me. Although it was kind of my fault. Let me explain the story. So this was back, I want to say maybe 2014. It was St. Patrick's Day. And so I went out to the Irish pub in Chengdu called the Shamrock, and was drinking on St. Patrick's Day, and I was walking home around 1:30 a.m. As a young man, I don't really do that much anymore. But as I'm walking home, I start to cross a footbridge, or just before I'm about to cross a footbridge where you have to walk up steps, go over the bridge that goes over the big avenue, and then get to the other side. There was a KTV, a karaoke place, which are very common in China. And a couple of Chinese guys walked out right at that moment and were very drunk. Like, they were absolutely hammered. And they kept trying to get my attention, and it was basically just because I was a foreigner. Like, they just lost all composure, and they were just like, foreigner, right? Come, talk to us, whatever. And I was tired and a little drunk myself, and I was just wanting to get away. And I was like, hey, don't bother me. But they kept following me as I was walking up the stairs. And in school, and this is one of the problems with university education, I had just learned from my vocab list the character and the word 滚, which I learned as meaning go away. But that's the problem with textbooks, because the fact is, 滚 is more accurately translated as off. That's what that means, right? And so I turned around to these guys because they were consistently bothering me as I was trying to cross this bridge. I turned around to them and I said, good. And boy, did they freak out, because they did not want to hear that from me. They started chasing me, and I didn't actually take it that seriously. And I remember it was lightly raining at the time, and the bridge itself was quite slick, and I had these sneakers on that had terrible treading on the bottom. And so I was kind of like gingerly sort of mildly jogging away from them. And I remember I kind of like had my hand sort of just like, get away, and I didn't notice that one of them had a bottle in their hand, smashed me in the head with the bottle. And it was like, whoa, right? So you can see how that's a little bit my fault. Now, somebody saying words doesn't justify smashing a bottle over their head, but it does go to show that when you just learn words from a vocabulary list, and this is early in my days of studying Chinese, this really kills your ability to know how to use it in context. You need to learn every word in proper context. It's also why you need to watch Chinese TV shows, you need to watch Chinese movies. You have to get a sense of in what emotional situation are they actually going to use these things. So I just wanted to point that out, that while it is true to say that China is a very safe place, everybody has their limit, and if you cross certain lines, it's not that Chinese people are unwilling to use violence. Number 12, colors and tolerance. I'd recommend knowing what different colors symbolize in China. There are a few that are kind of important. First of all, red, very lucky color, very associated with Chinese New Year, which is of course the time when we wish people the most luck. You'll give people hongbao, which is a red packet that you give with money on Chinese New Year. And white, here's one to know. White is the color of mourning. If you're mourning a family member who passed away, you'll wear white, not black like we do in the West. One of the things that people will do if they've had a family member that they lost recently is they'll wear a white headband or hat. And so I'd recommend for you to avoid wearing any white on your head if possible. But this is why I wanted to combine colors with tolerance. Chinese people aren't ignorant to the fact that you aren't Chinese, and therefore they don't begrudge you for failing to follow their cultural practices. So if I was out for a run wearing a white headband, people wouldn't be thinking, how rude. Instead, they just go, oh, they must not wear white to mourn family members in his country, right? Because since it is so ethnically homogenous there, foreigners who are not Asian stand out. The fact that you do something that's not the Chinese way of doing it does not mean that people will be offended. It does not mean that people will be angry with you. They don't expect you to follow their procedures. That said, if you know, then why not participate? When in Beijing, do as the Beijingers do, right? And I also just mention that when you do make an attempt to respect their culture, they really appreciate it. Because if they don't expect you to, and then you do it, you exceeded their expectations. I mean, everything's about expectation. If you go into a country and they expect you to follow their rules without you even knowing what they are, then you following their rules won't mean anything to them. They'll just be like, I expected that. But if you aren't expected to speak their language or respect their culture, and then you do, they love it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times there was just absolute delight when I got into a conversation with a Chinese person in Mandarin, because they were just excited that I even spoke their language at all, because they don't expect you to learn it. They think their language is really hard to learn. And so they go, wow, you must have put in a lot of time. That's very respectful towards our culture. On the one hand, you don't have to respect their culture because they don't expect you to. But on the second hand, if you do, you'll be very beloved. Also, don't wear a green hat. It signifies that your partner is cheating on you and that you've been cuckolded. My 13th observation about Chinese culture and people: listening to others. In conversation, I find Chinese people to be excellent listeners. I can't think of a conversation I had where my conversation partner wasn't open to having their ideas challenged and listen to my strong opinions. That's honestly true. Perhaps they criticize me in private, but never to my face. And that brings me to one of the topics I find Westerners frequently misunderstand about China, which is number 14, politics, religion, and sensitive topics. Okay, first, let me state the obvious. The CCP has forbidden posting online about several sensitive topics. So my official advice is not to do that while you're there. While this list isn't exhaustive, sensitive topics include the 3 Ts, Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen, the Hong Kong protests, the Uyghur re-education camps, the Falun Gong, or Xi Jinping being a dictator. However, in my experience, private citizens don't find these topics too sensitive to discuss. Remember, Chinese people are not all communists or even supporters of the CCP for ideological reasons. But the CCP has high approval ratings, Phil. Right, but that can be explained by what I consider to be the religion of China. So bear with me for a second. China is officially a secular country and has a very high percentage of people who classify themselves as atheist. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a religious instinct that emerged in China just like it does everywhere in the world. The religion of China is the great and glorious 5,000 years of history in the land under heaven. And I'm not mocking it. Chinese history is quite remarkable. But the reason I bring it up is that the average Chinese person sees a clear dividing line between the CCP and China. They view the CCP as the custodians of the great Chinese civilization. But if the population were ever to perceive the CCP as working against China, they'd lose their mandate very quickly. Just look at how rapidly the CCP lifted the COVID lockdowns after only a few weeks of protests in the autumn of 2022. If you're curious, look up the A4 revolution, the 白纸革命. And that A4 revolution was a point where the CCP had to reckon with the fact, and they always have to reckon with the fact, that even though they are a dictatorship with a history of communism, they are still a dictatorship of 1.4 billion people, and that has never happened in history. It's just interesting to think about, because imagine that you have 1.4 billion people. They view you as the custodian of what they consider much more important, which is the great civilization of China, and they might decide that you're no good. How scary would that be? We can't even imagine it, really, because there's never been that many people who could theoretically switch their minds. And by the way, Chinese people are very good at uniting. So if they unite against the CCP, look out. Now, while this is perhaps a crude analogy, here's a way you can think of it that will help hammer home this point. Think of the CCP as the Pope and the great civilization of China as God. If the Pope suddenly said, I know better than God, well, Christians would find a new Pope. And the same is true of what would happen if the CCP ever was perceived as hurting China. And now, listen, I know what a lot of you are thinking at this point. You're probably like, but the CCP engages in a bunch of propaganda. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. The CCP engages in propaganda meant to frame themselves as if they're the best custodians of China ever, and censors any information to the contrary. I'm definitely not denying that, and I want them to stop as soon as possible so that Chinese people can get the full scope of information that's available. But I'm merely trying to explain, how is it psychologically possible for private citizens to feel no particular hesitation in discussing these so-called sensitive topics? And the reason is what I just explained. I've frequently brought up politics and current events with Chinese friends, and I never once upset them, at least not openly, and it also never came back on me later. I never heard like, oh, they were really upset by that thing you said. And so if I did upset them, they kept it to themselves. I think that they were actually delighted to talk with a foreigner about these various topics. But listen, the best thing to do is just be respectful. Start with, what do you think about China's relationship with Taiwan or Hong Kong? I mean, one of the articles in our Mandarin Blueprint course is about the mainland China view of Hong Kong. And it was very enlightening to read. My point is just that don't assume that because the CCP is one way, that therefore a private citizen is going to report you to the CCP if you say something that is not within the strict letter of the law. It's not North Korea, and it's also not Maoist China. Now, it could go that way. I'm not denying that it could go that way in the future, but I still have friends there. I'm still aware of what's going on there. I was there until 2022, and you can talk about this stuff in private. Just don't post about it publicly online if you don't want to potentially be having an issue. And listen, if you're concerned about someone being offended by your viewpoint, just be Socratic. Ask them questions to tease out what they think without expressing your own opinion. I once had a long conversation with a guy who lived on the same dorm floor as the famous tank man from the '89 Tiananmen protests. You think I'm not going to ask about his experience? He was happy to share. The point is, be cautious, sure, but you don't have to be terrified that someone is going to report you to the CCP for expressing an opinion. And what's interesting is these conversations will teach you a lot about what it's like to live in a place where information is censored, but is still economically thriving. This is one of the most fascinating things about China, is that previously we had gone, well, the only way to have a thriving economy is to have free speech and free expression. China went, okay, let's go with economic liberalization, but not have political liberalization. And, time will tell, but at the moment anyway, it's just a fascinating place to kind of explore with the people you're talking to. Number 15. Showing emotion and saving face. There's a Confucian influence in Chinese culture that discourages wearing your heart on your sleeve. It is considered strong and strategically useful to avoid revealing your feelings. It's common to see someone smile when they're angry and laugh when something negative happens, and this is due, once again, to mianzi, face. One time when Luke got his bike stolen, a couple of guys laughed about it, and he took it as if they were mocking him, but it wasn't meant mockingly. Rather, it was meant to help Luke save face in the situation, because from their perspective, it's like, oh, if I laugh about this, it minimizes the importance. It's like, oh, this isn't a big deal. Your bike got stolen, whatever. This is an embarrassing thing for you, but I don't want you to feel that way. It's just them valuing a different thing than you do. Like, what we want to have is commiseration. Like, oh, that's such a shame that you got your bike stolen. Maybe I'll help you find the guy who stole it, that type of thing. Their attitude is like, oh, that must be so embarrassing for you that you got your bike stolen. You didn't log it up well enough. Ooh. Let me laugh about it to make you feel like this isn't that big of a deal. Who cares? Whatever. And so that is the attitude. And if you know that, you'll be able to avoid some awkward situations where you're like, what are you laughing at me for? It's like they're not laughing at you. They're trying to make you feel better. Number 16, integrity. I brought up scammers before, but they're far more rare than people who do what they say and act honorably. The best example of this has to do with my career as a musician in China. I played somewhere between 200 and 300 shows with my band, and apart from when I was under contract at a hotel, every show was technically under the table, but never once did anyone fail to pay me. They could have said, oh, sorry, we don't have your money, foreigner. What are you going to do about it? You weren't legally allowed to work here anyway. Yet despite having that option, nobody ever did that. Not once. Everyone who hired me paid me. Honorable. And that brings me to the next one, number 17, laws and police. So speaking of doing things that are technically against the rules, laws are really more like guidelines in China. Police are way more chilled. And to be clear, I'm talking about the police within the Han majority territory. So Eastern China, all the way to Sichuan. I'm sure that the police in Kashgar, Xinjiang are not exactly chilled. So I'm talking about the Han area, but I often saw police sitting around in their police golf carts, playing on their phones and looking entirely unthreatening. We're not talking about like jacked dudes with like shotguns and helmets. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because if you look at the world freedom indexes that rank countries based on overall freedom, China is always ranked very low. And there are some obvious reasons for that. I'm not saying it's totally wrong, but some of their metrics are based on letter of the law. But if certain laws are not enforced, then effectively you're still free to do it, right? So imagine that drinking on the street is illegal. Heck, it might even be illegal in China, I don't know, but everybody does it. You're allowed to do it and nobody cares, right? So if that's what happens, then the law is ineffective. I mean, there's actually a bunch of laws like this in the United States. You ever read those things that are like, the crazy law in Florida that says that you can't date a monkey with a goat in your guest room or something like that. Those laws are on the books, but nobody pays attention to them and they're not enforced, right? So they're effectively nothing. So that's what I mean when I say that the laws are sometimes more guidelines. I mean, I played a bunch of weddings as a musician and I did not have an entertainment work permit for the vast majority of it, but no one really cares. However, there is a problem, which is that sometimes the other shoe drops. And this actually happened in Chengdu circa 2019, 2020, something like that. At this point, I was working on Mandarin Blueprint mostly full time, and I played the occasional musical gig. And what happened was there was this new mayor in Chengdu who clearly had a directive from above to crack down on foreigners who were working illegally within their visa situations. So even though there were these laws in place already, they weren't being enforced until suddenly they were. And this is the problem with an authoritarian government that doesn't have to enforce some laws and then later they don't enforce the laws and they don't have to answer to anyone in that way. Like there's no potential election that could change the law or whatever. It does create the situation where suddenly on a dime, everything could change. Like one day they changed the law about after school education programs all across the country. I want to say that was 2021. And a bunch of my friends who taught in English schools that were just like after school English schools, the schools got shut down. Just like that, one day, law comes out. See ya, you lost your job. And this is the thing that can be difficult about living there. I'm sure if you're just visiting China, you may not have to deal with anything like that, but it does put a little bit of a sense of, I can't really be sure if what I'm doing is going to continue to be allowed moving forward. But I also just wanted to make the point that just because you see something isn't allowed doesn't mean that people don't kind of go, whatever, you can kind of just do it. Number 18, cultural conservatism. Listen, Chinese people are not as culturally progressive as Westerners in general. Women work at an extremely high rate, but traditional ideas of getting married and having a kid are still the status quo. Now in China, what they'll do is they'll have the grandparents take care of the kids while both parents go work, but there's a lot more pressure from parents to push their kids to start a family. And this is partially due to the Confucian influence, of course, and it's also partially due to the legacy of the one-child policy. If you can only have one child, then nothing could be more important. Just a quick sidebar here, despite repealing the one-child policy, the birth rate hasn't gone up very much because people got used to the idea of only having one kid, and the cost of living increase of 2 kids is more than the average Chinese family can bear. So even though the one-child policy is now repealed and you can have 3 kids, and they'll probably completely repeal it later because they're facing a demographic collapse, but it's kind of too late because everybody has decided that we don't want to have 2 kids. And so I think the birth rate is still like something like 1.2, and that's based on their numbers. They're kind of in a bit of a conundrum there. But if you can imagine that every family only has 1 kid, that creates a fairly large don't ask, don't tell mentality towards the gay community. Now, as a result of the one-child policy and parents and grandparents putting all of their hopes and dreams into this one child and the pressure that puts on the child, my friend and I, Scott, we did a podcast years ago where we interviewed different people around China, and one time we interviewed a gay guy because we were like, what's it like being gay in China? And it was very enlightening to hear what he had to say, because he explained that no one will ever ask about it in a professional context, but parents will definitely be upset because they only have the one son, and if he's gay, they theoretically won't have a grandchild. And so although he did say that his parents came around in the end, he said it took quite a long time, and they're the people who are the most upset by the situation because they want to, have a grandchild, right? But what was interesting, and the thing that I found so remarkable, was that after we recorded the podcast, and he was very open and interesting and shared what I thought was a very honest and open conversation, he messaged asking us to keep him anonymous because he didn't want his work colleagues hearing about it. And this was after he originally said, like, no, it's fine, you can use my name. He thought about it and was like, actually, don't use my name. And both Scott and I were sort of shocked by it because to both of our eyes, this guy wasn't hiding that he was gay. His behavior, fashion choices, tone of voice, it was all, like from my Western eye, it's like, oh, you're a gay guy, cool. But again, we go back to the saving face thing. Like, I thought surely all your coworkers can see this, but it saves face for his family if he doesn't talk about it publicly. And what's so interesting about that is that This all derives a little bit from government policy, a little bit of it derives from the fact that throughout history, almost every culture has had problems with people of his nature, and we're all sort of evolving, right? But another thing that was so fascinating about it was that it taught me that there's so many juggling things that we have with cultural and societal expectations. But when I say also that Chinese people are more culturally conservative, it's true to say that family values are very important, respecting your elders is very important, and these are things that your average American conservative would like. But nothing maps on perfectly. In China, they have a very liberal abortion policy because of the one-child policy, and of course American conservatives would hate that, right? So when I say, these words conservative and progressive, it doesn't always map perfectly, and that's why spending time in China is a very edifying experience, because it reminds you to step out of your own culture. In conclusion, while there's a great deal more I could tell you about life in China, I'll leave you with this idea that was inspired by Kaiser Kuo of the Sinica podcast. So if you live in China for a long enough time, you have to be able to hold contradictory ideas in your mind. If someone said Chinese people are the most malleable, the most flexible, the most able to reinvent themselves on a dime of any people in the world, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. Just look at what they've done since 1979. This is a very flexible group, right? But if someone also in the next minute said, Chinese people are terribly haunted by history. They're carrying around the most historical baggage of any group of people. They have the biggest historical chip on their shoulder of anyone around. I'd say, yeah, that's also correct. These two things seem absolutely contradictory, and yet I can accept them both as true, having been there in China. It's hard, for sure, but you at least stand a chance of digging into it if you get good at the language. And that's what we do here at Mandarin Blueprint. We make Mandarin simple and rewarding through remarkable Chinese courses. You can learn more through the link in the description. And also, let us know if you like this kind of video, and we'll be happy to do some more deep dives on life in the Middle Kingdom. 再见.